Well, the next stop on Anthony Albanese's diplomatic tour will see him meet with King Charles today after rubbing shoulders with world leaders in London. This comes as Prince William opens up about his. The world saw Prince William smiling on camera. Calm, composed, the perfect heir to the throne. But behind that royal grace, something had just shattered his world. Within hours, flight logs revealed a secret journey, an unannounced trip to Scotland that even palace staff couldn't explain. What did Prince William discover that drove him to flee the spotlight in silence? Was it a personal betrayal, a royal crisis, or something far deeper than the public will ever know? Stay with us, because what happened next in the Scottish Highlands would change everything for the future king. It began quietly, almost too quietly. On a cool Wednesday evening, a private jet lifted off from a discreet airfield outside London. There was no press notice, no official schedule, and no royal photographer waiting on the runway. The passenger on board was Prince William, the heir to the British throne, traveling without fanfare or entourage. Within minutes, the plane disappeared into the clouds, bound for Scotland. But why would a future king vanish from the public eye so suddenly? What could have been so urgent that even palace aides were caught by surprise? For a family that lives under constant watch, silence speaks volumes. Royal movements are usually calculated down to the second. Security teams are briefed, schedules are circulated, and every journey is logged for protocol. But this trip was different. The flight plan was filed under an alias. The departure time shifted twice in less than an hour. To insiders, it was clear something unusual was unfolding. Was it a health emergency within the family? Was William responding to a private crisis that the public was never meant to see? As the news broke through unofficial aviation trackers, social media erupted. Reports of an unannounced royal flight spread across forums and royal watch communities. Some believed he was visiting Balmoral for a private family meeting. Others suspected something more personal, a moment of emotional retreat. After all, William has often turned to the Scottish Highlands for peace in times of turmoil. It is the land of childhood memories, summers with his grandmother, and quiet moments far away from the cameras. But this time, the tone felt heavier. Journalists quickly began connecting the dots. Earlier that same day, William had been seen leaving a meeting at Windsor Castle, looking visibly tense. Cameras captured him glancing at his phone repeatedly, his expression unreadable. Moments later, his convoy changed course, avoiding the usual route home. By dusk, he was gone. No statement, no explanation, only whispers of a devastating discovery that had shaken the prince to his core. What could possibly drive a man known for composure to break royal routine so abruptly? In the absence of answers, speculation filled the air. Some royal correspondents pointed to internal tensions within the monarchy, others to new information about family affairs that had surfaced unexpectedly. There were even murmurs about private communications intercepted by the palace messages that revealed more than anyone was ready to handle. Could that be true? Or was this simply another chapter in the endless scrutiny of Britain's most watched family? As the jet touched down on Scottish soil late that night, rain poured over the runway, shrouding everything in secrecy. No cameras, no crowd, just a single figure stepping into the mist, carrying the weight of something the world had yet to understand. One question lingered in every observer's mind. What did Prince William discover that sent him fleeing to Scotland in silence? And what truth awaited him there? In the weeks leading up to the secret journey, Prince William's public appearances told a story few were willing to see. Every handshake, every smile, every carefully rehearsed expression painted a picture of calm, royal composure. Yet behind the warmth and charm, there was a quiet tension that seemed to ripple beneath the surface. Those who observed him closely noticed the subtle shifts. His laughter came less easily. His gaze often drifted as though his thoughts were far from the crowd standing before him. At a mental health charity event in Manchester, William delivered an inspiring speech on resilience and community. The cameras captured his steady tone and practiced ease. But as he stepped off the stage, an aide handed him a folded note. His expression changed for a fraction of a second, the kind of flicker only those trained to see beyond the surface could detect. Moments later, he was ushered into a waiting car and left the venue without the usual cheerful wave to the press. The image of a man weighed down by invisible burdens lingered long after the applause had faded. Observers close to the royal circle began to whisper. The prince had quietly postponed several engagements. His team cited scheduling conflicts, yet the pattern was unmistakable. Public smiles were now separated by long periods of withdrawal. When he did appear, his voice carried a depth that hinted at something deeply personal. To many, it felt like he was holding himself together by sheer duty. Within the walls of Kensington Palace, staff members spoke of an unusual quietness. William had been spending long hours in his private study, often leaving notes for aides instead of discussing matters face to face. Meetings, once filled with laughter, had turned formal, brief, and tense. Family portraits in his office remained where they always were, but visitors said he would occasionally glance at them with a distant look, as if trying to draw strength from the faces frozen in happier times. The British press, often relentless in its pursuit of royal stories, began to take notice. Tabloid headlines speculated about stress, exhaustion, and the toll of public life. Official palace sources dismissed such claims, emphasizing that the prince was focused on his duties, but the calm phrasing only deepened the mystery. The reality behind closed doors was that something had unsettled William profoundly, something that had fractured his rhythm and drained the ease from his smile. Friends who had known him for decades described a shift in his tone during conversations. Where once he spoke eagerly about his projects and family, his recent words carried caution. His sentences were shorter, his humor more restrained. In public, he still embodied the image of leadership. In private, however, he was quietly unraveling a situation that had left him deeply conflicted. The evening before his sudden flight, he was seen driving alone through Windsor grounds, headlights cutting through the misty air. There were no escorts, no flashing motorcycles, only a solitary vehicle gliding through the darkness. Witnesses described him as motionless behind the wheel, gripping the steering wheel with both hands, lost in thought. When he returned home later that night, staff members noted that he stayed awake long past midnight, pacing his study in silence. The next morning, he appeared before photographers at a small environmental event, smiling as always, his tie impeccably straight, his posture faultless. But beneath the tailored suit, his heart carried a heaviness that no camera could capture. Every gesture seemed measured, every word chosen with deliberate care, as though he was shielding himself from the weight of an unseen truth. The photographs from that day, later re-examined by the media, would become haunting symbols of a man balancing duty and distress. Behind the grandeur and precision of royal life, Prince William was facing a storm that words could not express. The charm that once came naturally now served as armor. His smile remained, but it no longer reached his eyes. Every public appearance became an act of quiet endurance. The future king was performing his role flawlessly, yet each step, each handshake, each polite nod carried the silent echo of a heavy heart that was breaking beneath the weight of what he knew. The truth, when it finally came to light, was not a sudden explosion but a slow unraveling that began behind closed doors. It was a whisper that grew louder with every passing hour. A confidential file, a private report, and a series of messages had reached Prince William's desk just days before his unexpected departure. The contents of those documents would shake even the strongest of hearts. They spoke of betrayal, loss, and a revelation that threatened to redefine everything he thought he understood about loyalty and family. Inside Kensington Palace, the atmosphere shifted. Trusted aides who had served the prince for years described the silence that followed as heavy and unsettling. The usual rhythm of the household stopped. Meetings were cancelled. Phones went unanswered, and those who worked closest to him noticed that William began spending hours locked in his private study. He was seen reading through stacks of paper, his expression growing darker with each page. When he finally emerged, his steps were slow, his face pale. Something within him had changed. Sources close to the royal household later hinted that the information came unexpectedly through a source outside the palace. It was something no one had been prepared to confront. The details were kept under strict confidentiality, but the timing aligned with a significant event that had been quietly removed from the public diary. Behind the walls of royal protocol, it was clear that the prince was processing something too painful to share. The people around him tried to continue as usual. There were briefings to attend, documents to sign, and appearances to maintain. But those who met him in those days said his focus seemed distant, his responses mechanical. He was polite, composed, but detached. Every so often, his gaze would drift toward the window, lingering on the horizon as though searching for something beyond his reach. The weight of his discovery had already begun to isolate him from the world that depended on his calm authority. At home, the strain was visible. Family dinners that once carried laughter were subdued. His children, unaware of the turmoil, played in the gardens while their father paced through corridors lost in thought. The few friends who reached out found their calls unanswered. For a man raised in the public eye, this retreat into solitude was telling. The news he had received had not only shaken his confidence in those around him but reopened deep personal wounds that had never fully healed. By the time the decision to travel to Scotland was made, William's silence had become his only refuge. Scotland was not just a destination. It was a place of memory, healing, and ancestral connection. It was where his grandmother had found peace, and where his mother had once sought solace from the chaos of royal life. For him, it represented the one place untouched by scandal or deceit, a landscape that still held truth among its ancient stones and open skies. The flight was arranged quietly, away from official channels. Only a small circle was informed, and even they were given limited details. When the jet finally lifted from the runway, it carried not just the heir to the throne but a man burdened by revelation. The magnitude of what he had learned could not be erased by power or position. It demanded silence, space, and distance from the eyes of a watching world. As the plane descended through the Scottish mist, William's mind replayed the moments leading up to his decision. Every conversation, every warning he had once dismissed, now echoed with new meaning. The truth had been there all along, waiting for the right moment to emerge. Now it stood before him in full clarity, impossible to ignore. The discovery had been devastating not only for what it revealed, but for what it destroyed, the fragile trust that had held together his private world. In the stillness of that journey, Prince William was no longer just the public figure shaped by tradition and duty. He was a man confronting a revelation that stripped away every title and expectation. In that solitude, he faced the one reality that no crown could shield him from the painful cost of truth. The air in Scotland carried a calm that London could never offer. The vast highlands stretched out under a silver sky, the scent of pine and rain lingering over the valleys. When Prince William's car finally wound through the narrow road leading to Balmoral Castle, it was well past midnight. The headlights cut through the mist, reflecting against the iron gates of the royal estate. For generations, Balmoral had been a place of refuge, a fortress of silence for the royal family when the world became too loud. Now, it stood waiting for another wounded heir to seek its shelter. Inside the castle, only a handful of staff were aware of his arrival. Security was tightened, cameras were disabled, and public access to the surrounding grounds was quietly restricted. The visit was classified as personal, though everyone who worked within those stone walls understood that it was more than that. The prince had come not for leisure, but for clarity. The next morning, the stillness of Balmoral was interrupted only by the sound of footsteps on gravel and the distant hum of wind sweeping through the trees. William spent hours walking the same paths once favored by his grandmother. The solitude of the Highlands allowed him to think without the constant shadow of duty. He had brought no press team, no assistants, only a single aide who understood the weight of silence. In a secluded wing of the castle, a meeting was quietly arranged. Trusted royal advisors arrived in unmarked vehicles, their presence noted only by a few local journalists who sensed that something unusual was unfolding. Behind closed doors, conversations stretched late into the afternoon. Documents were reviewed, statements debated, and difficult truths confronted. For William, each discussion deepened the magnitude of what he had discovered back in London. The evidence before him was irrefutable. It had the potential to shake not only his personal foundation but also the institution he was born to lead. Witnesses later described his demeanor during those meetings as grave but composed. He listened more than he spoke, weighing every word with the patience of a man who understood that one wrong move could echo for generations. In moments of pause, he would step to the window, gazing out toward the hills that rolled endlessly into the horizon. Those close to him said it was as though he was seeking an answer from the landscape itself, a silent counsel from the same wilderness that had comforted his ancestors. In the evenings, he withdrew to the small family chapel on the estate. There, under the dim light of flickering candles, he sat in the pews long after prayers had ended. The staff who tended the chapel noticed he often arrived alone, his head bowed, his expression unreadable. Whatever burden he carried, he was laying it before something greater than himself. For the royal family, Balmoral had always symbolized tradition and retreat. For William, it now became the stage for an inner reckoning. The walls that once echoed with laughter during family holidays now bore witness to his quiet struggle. Every corridor reminded him of the lineage he represented, and every portrait seemed to watch in silent expectation. Outside, the Scottish rain began to fall again, soft and unending. It washed over the castle roofs, the gardens, and the stone paths where William walked in solitude. Somewhere between the whispering winds and the weight of memory, he made a silent decision, a resolution that would guide his next steps when he returned to London. The time for reflection was coming to an end. The truth he had faced at Balmoral demanded action. And though his heart was still heavy, his resolve had begun to take shape. The prince who had arrived broken in spirit was slowly finding the strength to stand again. The quiet of Balmoral carried more than the sound of rain and wind. It carried memories. Every stone, every corridor, every field seemed to whisper the name of his mother, Princess Diana. For Prince William, this was not just a place of retreat. It was a sanctuary connected to the deepest parts of his past. Here, the echoes of his childhood mixed with the lessons of loss. And it was in those echoes that he began to find meaning in the pain that had driven him north. He walked the same trails she once loved, the same open fields where she had brought him and Harry as boys to escape the glare of royal life. Those days had been full of laughter and innocence, but they now felt like distant shadows. As he looked across the misty hills, he could almost hear her voice, gentle, protective, urging him to stay strong. In that moment, the son remembered the woman who had taught him that love could survive even in the coldest palace halls. William had spent much of his adult life balancing two worlds, the one shaped by duty and the one his mother had modeled a life grounded in compassion, empathy, and truth. The discovery that had shattered his peace was testing that balance. It demanded both strength and wisdom, qualities Diana had tried to nurture in him from the start. As he wrestled with the information that had reached him, he found himself thinking of how she had faced betrayal, heartbreak, and isolation, yet never allowed bitterness to rule her spirit. Inside Balmoral's library, William spent long hours reading through personal notes and letters preserved from his grandmother's collection. Among the carefully kept documents was a handwritten letter from his mother, written in the late 90s. Its words were simple yet piercing. She had written of her hope that her sons would stand for honesty when the world chooses silence. Those lines struck him deeply. They reminded him that legacy is not preserved by perfection, but by courage. The weight of that legacy pressed on him now. His mother's experiences had shown him what happens when truth is buried for the sake of appearances. The discovery he had made in recent days carried a similar warning. It was something that could not be ignored, something that threatened to repeat the very mistakes that had haunted his family for decades. He realized that to stay silent would be to betray the principles she had died defending. In the privacy of the castle's drawing room, William began to write. He filled pages with thoughts, reflections, and plans, lines that spoke of pain, but also of determination. It was as though the act of writing connected him to her spirit, reminding him that his journey was part of a larger story still unfolding. The ink became his confession, his prayer, and his promise. By nightfall, he returned once more to the small chapel. The air was cool, and the candles burned low. He sat in silence, his hands folded, his head bowed. Above him, the stained glass window glowed faintly in the flickering light, depicting a mother and child surrounded by angels. The symbolism was not lost on him. This was where he understood that grief, when faced with courage, could become guidance. His mother's life had been marked by heartbreak, but her legacy was one of love and resilience. And now it was his turn to carry that legacy forward. As dawn broke over the highlands, the first light of day fell across the estate, illuminating the mist that clung to the hills. William stood by the window, eyes fixed on the horizon. The journey that had begun in secrecy was turning into something deeper, a confrontation, not just with discovery, but with destiny. His mother's spirit seemed to move with the wind outside, a silent reminder that truth, no matter how painful, must always be faced. In that still moment, Prince William was no longer running from what he had learned. He was standing within it, allowing the lessons of the past to prepare him for what lay ahead. The shadow of his mother's legacy had once brought sorrow, but now it offered strength. The boy who had once walked beside her in these same fields was now a man walking into the storm she had once warned him would come, and he was ready to meet it. When Prince William returned to London, the stillness of Balmoral quickly faded. Inside the palace walls, whispers moved faster than footsteps. Every conversation seemed to stop when he entered a room. The discovery that had driven him to Scotland was no longer just a private burden. It had become the unspoken tension dividing those closest to him. Royal aides, advisors, and family members found themselves on uncertain ground. Some believed transparency was the only way to protect the monarchy's integrity. Others urged silence, insisting that certain truths must remain locked behind palace doors. For centuries, discretion had been the monarchy's armor. But William no longer saw silence as strength. He had watched what secrecy had done to his mother, and he carried the memory of that pain as a warning. Meetings once filled with polite efficiency now pulsed with unease. Late-night discussions unfolded in guarded tones, words chosen with precision. The walls of Kensington Palace seemed to listen. William spoke little, but his silence carried weight. He was thinking not only as a son and heir, but as a man aware that his every decision could alter the institution's course. The rift within the family deepened. Communication between key members grew cold, marked by pauses and polite distance. The trust that once existed had fractured under the strain of hidden truths, even among those sworn to loyalty. Uncertainty spread like a quiet storm. William's sense of isolation returned, sharper now that he was surrounded by formality rather than the peaceful silence of the Highlands. In the private rooms of Windsor, father and son met several times. The king, seasoned in royal endurance, counseled caution. He spoke of legacy, unity, and the importance of preserving the monarchy's dignity. William listened respectfully, his expression calm, but his mind remained fixed on conviction rather than comfort. For him, leadership meant confronting what others avoided, not burying what had already surfaced. Through it all, Catherine remained his constant presence. In their quiet moments, she became his sounding board and his calm. Together they faced the growing storm with quiet strength, aware that the world outside was already speculating. The House of Windsor stood under pressure once again, divided not by scandal alone, but by a painful truth and the courage it demanded. In the mist-covered Highlands, Scotland kept its secrets well. The small villages surrounding Balmoral had long grown used to the rhythms of royal visits, but this one carried a different tone. There were no photographers waiting at the gates, no cheerful greetings from the locals. The arrival of Prince William came and went without ceremony, wrapped in a quiet tension that seemed to settle over the land itself. Residents of Ballater and Crathy spoke later of subtle changes. Black vehicles moved through narrow roads at odd hours. Police patrols increased around the estate, and local deliveries were suddenly redirected. Everyone sensed that something important was unfolding behind those castle walls. Yet no one dared to ask questions. In this part of Scotland, silence was a form of loyalty. One morning before sunrise, a fisherman along the River Dee noticed a solitary figure walking the bank. The man wore a dark coat and cap, his step slow, his posture heavy. It was unmistakably the prince. He paused often, gazing at the still water as the fog drifted past. The witness said he looked not like a royal, but like any man carrying grief. The chapel on the estate became his refuge. Its caretaker later recalled the faint sound of footsteps at night, followed by the creak of a door and the glow of candlelight. William would remain there for hours, motionless, his head bowed in prayer or deep thought. The solitude of the Highlands seemed to absorb his sorrow. Locals respected the silence. They turned away when his convoy passed, offering space instead of curiosity. For centuries, Scotland had been a royal sanctuary, a place where the burdens of crown and title could fade into the mist. It became that again now, his shelter in the storm. By the end of his stay, those who caught a glimpse of him noticed something had changed. His face was pale, his eyes tired, but his steps were firmer. The land had listened. The silence had steadied him. Scotland, ancient and loyal, had borne witness to his pain, and in doing so had helped him find the strength to return to the world that waited beyond the hills. When Prince William's jet touched down in London, the air felt heavier than when he had left. The quiet refuge of the Highlands was behind him, and ahead lay the relentless scrutiny of palace life. The moment his car rolled through the gates of Kensington Palace, the silence that had surrounded his trip was replaced by questions from aides, from advisors, and from a press corps already circling for answers. Inside the palace, the atmosphere was tense. Staff members who had kept to their duties in his absence now avoided direct eye contact. They had read the headlines, seen the speculation, and understood that something significant had taken place. William moved through the halls with quiet resolve, acknowledging greetings with a nod but offering no explanations. The time for reflection was over. Decisions would soon have to be made. Publicly, his first engagement after returning was a community event in London. Cameras clicked, reporters shouted, and yet his demeanor remained calm, measured, almost unreadable. He smiled for photographs, but the warmth that usually defined his presence seemed muted. Observers noted the weariness in his eyes, the kind that no amount of rest could erase. Palace sources released a short statement calling his trip a period of private reflection. It was brief, deliberately vague, and did little to calm the storm. The media seized on every word, analyzing tone and timing, while royal experts debated its deeper meaning. Some believed he had gone north to process family issues. Others claimed the trip was tied to matters of royal security or personal loss. The truth remained behind closed doors, guarded as tightly as the man himself. Back home, his children's laughter filled the gardens once again. Catherine kept their home calm and steady, shielding the family from noise beyond the walls. Yet even she knew the weight he carried. The days ahead would demand composure, diplomacy, and discernment. As evening settled over London, William stood by his study window, looking toward the fading skyline. The questions outside grew louder, but inside he had already made peace with one certainty. The truth, whatever its cost, would soon have to come to light. The days that followed his return unfolded slowly, marked by silence, reflection, and a quiet strength that seemed to grow with each sunrise. Prince William carried himself with renewed purpose, yet there was a gravity in his every movement. He had confronted the truth in Scotland, and now he bore its weight with the calm endurance of a man who understood that leadership is often forged in private pain. Behind palace walls, discussions continued. Advisors debated statements, strategies, and the balance between transparency and protection. William listened, but the decision was already forming within him. He knew that the monarchy's survival did not depend on silence. It depended on trust. And trust, once broken, could only be rebuilt through honesty. The lessons of his mother's life and the echoes of Balmoral's stillness had guided him toward a single conviction: truth must never be hidden for convenience. In his private moments, he thought of the generations who had carried the crown before him, the triumphs, the sacrifices, and the secrets that had shaped their reigns. He realized that his path would be different. The world was changing, and the future of the monarchy would demand transparency rather than tradition alone. The discovery that had once shattered him now gave him clarity. It was no longer just a wound. It had become a turning point. One morning he met again with his father. The conversation was quiet but profound. Respect filled the room, though unspoken tension lingered between experience and conviction. In the end, both men understood that change, though painful, was inevitable. For the monarchy to endure, it had to adapt. William's resolve was clear, and his father, recognizing that same strength in him, did not stand in his way. What do you think about this story? Please share your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more videos like this. Thanks for watching.